So I'm Vipin Narang. I teach at MIT down the street, and I'm going to talk about nuclear South Asia, which is a good place, I think, to end this panel, because a lot of the issues that Jim and Will brought up have emerged in South Asia in ways that I don't think we anticipated 20 years ago when India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons. We're approaching the 20-year anniversary in May of the overt nuclearization of South Asia. And so what I thought I'd do is just walk through the evolution of the nuclear dynamics historically between India and Pakistan, and we'll see how some of the issues, especially that Jim and some of the concerns that Will brought up, show up in South Asia. And I think South Asia, this past couple months, is vying with North Korea for the world's most dangerous flashpoint for nuclear use. And we're already seeing the most violent year in Kashmir across the line of control. And I think we cannot and should not underestimate the degree to which a slow burn between India and Pakistan can lead to a major militarized crisis. And they're both adopting kind of the worst habits of Cold War nuclear doctrines and strategies. And it's a tinderbox waiting, I think, to explode. So let's just walk through the history, right? So everyone thinks that nuclearization is a nice big mushroom cloud. May 1998, India and Pakistan test nuclear weapons. It wasn't pretty. Buried in the deserts, in the mountains of Rajasthan and the Chagai Hills in India and Pakistan. But it was a long time coming. India tested a peaceful nuclear explosion, euphemistically. It wasn't a nuclear weapon, but it was a nuclear device in 1974. Pakistan had lost a major war to India in 1971 and was already pursuing nuclear weapons through the 1970s. A.Q. Khan had come back and established the uranium enrichment program. So, the narrative is that India's bomb begat Pakistan's bomb. That isn't entirely true. It was the defeat in 1971 at India's hands and the birthing of Bangladesh that birthed Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. India pursued nuclear weapons for a variety of reasons. China had tested. India had lost a war to China. In 1974, they test the peaceful nuclear explosion. But for Pakistan, the modus, the raison d'etre for the nuclear weapons program was to avoid a defeat by Indian conventional forces. Much like, seeing itself like NATO in the Cold War, facing a conventionally superior nuclear power, Pakistan believed that the only way to offset Indian conventional power was to threaten to use nuclear weapons first against advancing conventional forces. So first use battlefield targets to try to degrade India's ability to sustain the conventional attack on Pakistan. After both countries tested in 1998, Pakistan moved very quickly to establish this strategy, even when it didn't have the capabilities to threaten battlefield use the way it eventually incorporated in the late 2000s. So the first round of India-Pakistan conflict was the 1999 Kargil War, a year after both countries tested nuclear weapons. And this kind of gave a preview of what nuclear South Asia would look like. For India, from India's perspective, Pakistan was using its nuclear weapons as a shield behind which to aggress against India and pursue long-standing revisionist objectives in Kashmir and against homeland India. So in 1999, the Kargil War led to infiltration across the line of control from Pakistan using irregular forces with the Northern Light Infantry. And it was a replay of the 1965 operation that Pakistan had attempted against India, Operation Gibraltar. Now in 1965, India had no qualms about opening a second front across the international border. And India and Pakistan view a huge distinction between the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir and the international border. So in 1965, India hit behind the line of control, opened a second front, and defeated Pakistani forces. Opening the second front forces Pakistan to recommit forces, and so it's India's mainstay strategy. In 1999, which is a replay of the same operation effectively for Pakistan, India did not threaten to open a second front and did not hit across the line of control. So the Indian Air Force, for the first time in its history, was prohibited from crossing the line of control to hit back at Pakistani positions. So from Pakistan's perspective, the strategy was working. They had inhibited India's conventional response in ways that India had never been previously deterred from doing. And the most obvious comparison was 1965. Then fast forward to 2001. We forget about this attack because it was on the heels of 9/11 in a lot of ways, and we were ramping up for the war in Afghanistan. But there was a really audacious attack on Indian Parliament in December of 2001. A band of militants from Pakistan, part of the Jaish-e-Mohammed militant group, stormed Parliament or tried to storm Parliament while it was sitting. And we talk about decapitation attacks. This was an attempt at decapitating the Indian government. And it led to a 10-month standoff between India and Pakistan. So this was a kind of emboldenment that we worry about, for example, North Korea sponsoring, using its nuclear weapons as a shield to deter our retaliation. Well, so what happened this time? This is a pretty audacious attack. The Indian government was outraged, and it led to a 10-month mobilization. India mobilized for the first time in its history 800,000 forces and threatened an offensive retaliatory strike across the international border. They sat there for 10 months while Pakistan tested nuclear-capable missiles to deter the attack. And finally, the Indian government stood down and sent the forces back to their peacetime cantonments. And so the narrative in Pakistan, again, was this is working. Our nuclear capabilities and our threat of first use against India is deterring conventional attack and conventional retaliation, so we can do more. And India's nuclear weapons can't deter terrorist attacks or fait accomplis in Kargil. So India at this point is, paralyzed. The Indian government says, well, how do we respond to the Pakistani emboldenment using nuclear weapons as a shield behind which to aggress? The first round of evolution in Indian strategic thinking was trying to adjust the conventional retaliatory options. So instead of mobilizing 800,000 forces, 3 big strike corps, and we talk about the concept that India has and I think still has in its toolkit, it said, well, why don't we develop more limited conventional options, right? So this is kind of, in line with what we're thinking about with the bloody nose strategy. Instead of mobilizing 3 big strike corps, let's pre-position some offensive elements and be able to retaliate quickly. The lesson for the army after the Parliament attack was it took too long to mobilize 800,000 forces. It took a month. You have to evacuate people. You have to station, food, water, toilet paper, everything, right? And then you have to position all your military equipment from the interior of India. Well, the army said that took too long, and we lost our window of opportunity to really hurt Pakistan's army. And if we go deep, as we have long planned to do, we risk triggering nuclear use with Pakistan. Because that would be an existential threat to the Pakistanis. Especially, the Pakistanis really fear this thrust through the desert. Because Indians could really get moving, and that's their primary armor thrust. So India moves to this idea of cold start. Has anyone heard of cold start? So cold start was, Fiona's heard. She's my student. So. The idea was, the Indian Army said, we need to be able to start offensive operations from a cold start. 48 to 72 hours after political authorization to retaliate against Pakistan. And so we're going to break up the strike corps, pre-position some of these elements, have more shallow and limited objectives, and we'll be able to attrit the Pakistani military, right? So cold start just means being able to start from what the Indian Army believes is literally a cold start, very little lead time, and exploit the window of opportunity to retaliate. Okay, so you develop this concept. Well, so Pakistan says, well, how do we pour cold water on cold start? This is what the Pakistanis used to say. Tactical nuclear weapons. So as India is developing this cold start option, Pakistan moves to develop and operationalize battlefield nuclear weapons. They call them battlefield nuclear weapons because they're not really of tactical yield. They're still, we think several kiloton nuclear weapons. But they're short range, and they're designed to be used on logistics heads, bridge heads, on Pakistani soil as Indian conventional forces are attacking. So Pakistan moves to develop shorter range, lower yield options to what, as they say, pour cold water on cold start, or cold start will end in a hot war, right? They have all these great lines. But if you're Pakistan and you use nuclear weapons on Indian forces, India is a nuclear weapons state. How do you deter Indian nuclear retaliation? Well, you develop long-range strategic forces. So the theory of victory for Pakistan, India ever initiates a cold start operation is to use tactical nuclear weapons on Indian forces first, and then use the long-range strategic nuclear systems. They're equivalent of ICBMs, but they're really short range because these two states border each other, that target Indian cities to deter Indian nuclear retaliation. So that creates the space for Pakistan to have this war-winning strategy. So if there's a terrorist attack in metropolitan India, Indian army retaliates against Pakistan, gets going in the desert. Pakistan thinks it can use tactical nuclear weapons in a limited way and deter Indian nuclear retaliation because it will have survivable second strike forces to be able to target Indian cities. And the Pakistani leadership at that point thinks, would an Indian prime minister risk Delhi and Bombay after Pakistan had used nuclear weapons on its own soil against advancing conventional forces that were attacking Pakistan? They hypothesized no. And we tested this concept and this idea in the 2008 Bombay attack. So in 2008, the Lashkar-e-Taiba came via sea route from Karachi to Bombay, shut down the city for 3 days, killed 173 civilians. In the US, if this had happened in New York or Washington, D.C., can you imagine what the United States response would be? What did India do? Here's a chance to test cold start. You've developed this conventional option to supposedly get out of this paralysis of not having a conventional option against Pakistan's emboldenment, and the Indian government did nothing because it was deterred. The paradox of cold start, which India never really solved, is that any retaliation that is strong enough to deter, or punitive enough to deter the Pakistan army from sponsoring terrorists, fundamentally risks triggering Pakistani nuclear red lines. So they could never calibrate those operations. The idea of, the Indian army says, we have space under the nuclear overhang to retaliate against Pakistan. The problem is, once Pakistan fields these tactical nuclear weapons, there are 9 overhangs, because everybody who has nuclear weapons, all the brigadiers that have possession of the tactical nuclear weapons can decide, this is the day the Pakistani state is going to end, we're going to use nuclear weapons. You can't calibrate 9 different red lines. And the Indian civilian leadership understood this theoretical problem, that once you get going, you don't know where you're going to stop, and you don't know where Pakistan's red lines really are. And Pakistan has intentionally manipulated those red lines. And so 2008 was a watershed for Indian security, the security establishment, because you've developed this cold start option, but it doesn't solve the fundamental paradox of, anything that is punitive enough to deter Pakistani support of terrorism is going to really risk triggering the red lines, because you really have to start attriting the army, and these are clear red lines for the Pakistani state. So that now we entered in the last decade, I think, the evolution on the Indian side, and they started, I think, making adjustments to nuclear strategy, or at least thinking about making adjustments to nuclear strategy. So let's talk about Indian nuclear doctrine. So India is unique in the sense it's one of the few states that actually has a nuclear doctrine. We have nuclear posture reviews, but India is one of the few states that has a publicly released doctrine. And they released it in 2003, and they haven't changed it since, which seems a little odd. You think a doctrine is a living, breathing thing. But for the Indians, it's like the Bible. It's the Old Testament. And it's got 3 big pillars. 3 books of the New Testament, right? So the first is credible minimum deterrent. The second is no first use, which is caveated in bullet point number 6, which threatens first use against chemical and biological weapons in the official doctrine itself. But they will claim, you'll hear India claim we have an absolute no first use doctrine, but I'm not so sure that's true. And the third pillar is nuclear retaliation will be massive. So this is kind of what Jim was referring to as an assured retaliation strategy. India says, look, we have a conventional advantage over Pakistan. We don't need to use nuclear weapons first in any contingency. But if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons against India, our retaliation will be massive. And this was always interpreted to be counter value. Counter value being targeting Pakistani cities. In 2003, this worked. Pakistan didn't have or threaten tactical nuclear weapons use on India. So if Pakistan used nuclear weapons on an Indian city, India would destroy several Pakistani cities in retaliation, and that was supposed to be mutually assured destruction. In their intervening period, Pakistan developed tactical nuclear weapons. So now the problem that India confronted was, if Pakistan uses tactical nuclear weapons on its own soil, could an Indian prime minister really order the retaliation and destroy 7 Pakistani cities and kill millions of Pakistani citizens? Pakistan banked no. And after 2008, there was a lot of discussion about whether India was, you hear this term self-deterred a lot now, whether India was self-deterred because it doesn't have a credible nuclear retaliatory option, so it can't even start with the conventional option, because if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons, India doesn't have an answer. This got Indian security managers thinking. If we can't fight below the nuclear overhang, what about removing the overhang altogether? And this is starting, there's tantalizing evidence that India is starting to think about counterforce strategies. And the reason this is important is because in all the academic and policy literature, we thought that the only state that does and considers counterforce strategies, targeting your adversary's nuclear weapons directly, was the United States. And we could talk about different reasons why the US did it, extended deterrence. The US hates being vulnerable to another state's nuclear forces. The Soviets had some counterforce elements in their doctrine too, but it was really the United States that has persistently pursued counterforce capabilities and doctrines against its adversaries. We didn't think the regional powers could. It's very expensive. It's very hard to do. You need to have missile defenses to pick up residuals that you might miss if you start targeting an adversary's nuclear weapons. But here's India, a national security advisor, talking about very clearly in a book he wrote and released last year, Shiv Shankar Menon, and the national security advisor in India is the point person on nuclear strategy and weapons in a way that isn't true in the United States. Talk about if anybody wants further details on that. The national security advisor is the most authoritative person in the Indian system, and the point person on nuclear strategy and release, he or she would be the person that actually ordered the release of nuclear weapons in the system, not the prime minister, technically. And so he writes this book, passages that were kind of overlooked but were critically important to how the thinking has evolved in India. Instead of allowing Pakistan to use a nuclear shield behind which to aggress, India is starting to think about developing options to remove the shield altogether and open up the conventional space it once had. So India is supposed to have a no first use policy, right? But here he's talking about if Pakistan used nuclear weapons, India would threaten a massive Indian first strike against Pakistan. Now you think, well, but India has no first use. And this is where nuclear jargon really, I think, annoys people. There is a critical distinction between first use and first strike. In the Cold War, first strike was a euphemism for counterforce. And comprehensive first strike is a euphemism for what we call a splendid first strike, trying to go after all of the strategic systems of the adversary. And so when Menon is talking about a first strike here, he's not talking about necessarily violating no first use, although when you go to counterforce strategies, you do have to start thinking about preemption, because you cannot afford to go second if you're trying to target another state's nuclear weapons, because you can't lose any. You've assigned N number of your own weapons to their weapons, and if you start losing some, the calculation goes out the window. So here he's talking about, why would I engage in a tit-for-tat exchange with Pakistan? I'm just going to go and try and get all of their strategic systems. And it's not that many. Pakistan developed, they have tens of strategic weapons, 30, 40 tops, because they've invested so much in their tactical nuclear force. And we had this notion that India and Pakistan would not make the same mistakes or go down the same pathway, maybe they're not mistakes, that the United States and the Soviet Union did. But the evolution of the security dynamic in India and Pakistan has led India to the conclusion that it can no longer tolerate the kind of instability and emboldenment that Pakistan unleashes against it, right? There's always this notion, no more Bombays for India. And so they tried playing around with a conventional option. That didn't work. And now it seems like they're trying to tinker with their nuclear strategy and develop options at least. It may not be their primary option, but an option at least to disarm the Pakistani state completely. And that's really dangerous, right? We didn't think regional powers, small powers with limited capabilities and surveillance and intelligence would go down the path of counterforce, because you have to be able to find, fix, and destroy all of the systems your adversary has on land and maybe at sea, right? And this is relevant to the North Korean case too. How confident are we that we can go after and get all of the North Korean systems? So in order to do this, India has to be confident it can find, fix, and destroy all of the Pakistani strategic nuclear systems at least. And if it can't find all of them, then you have to get into the 90% effectiveness of your missile defense system to pick up whatever you miss. So if you miss 3 or 4 Pakistani systems, are you confident that your ballistic missile defense is going to pick up the rest? So we're entering a phase in South Asia, which I think is very dangerous. And it's not, as India moves towards this and starts talking about counterforce against Pakistan, Pakistan's not going to sit idly by and do nothing. The answer to a state developing or pursuing counterforce is build more weapons, so you can't get them all, and move them around so they can't find them when they have to. In a country that's already riddled by significant amounts of militancy. So when we talk about nuclear terrorism, if India puts pressure on Pakistan to build up, build out, and move their weapons around quickly so that India can't destroy them in a counterforce mission, in a country with that level of militancy, then we have to pay very stark attention to the threats of nuclear terrorism, which we're already worried about, but as they build more, it'll become more acute. So I'll stop there. We look forward to questions. A lot of these issues are related across North Korea. We haven't talked about Russia. We can talk about Russia too, and South Asia. So thank you for your attention.